module, we'll be discussing intellectual disabilities. Our learning targets for this module include defining the characteristics of intellectual disabilities, thinking about creative ways to modify the curriculum for successful inclusion of students who have intellectual disabilities, and planning for teaming with specialists to meaningfully include students with intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disability is defined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act as significantly subaverage general intellectual functioning, existing concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior and manifested during the developmental period that adversely affects a child's educational performance. You'll notice that throughout all of the definitions of disability in the law, in Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in the U.S., that the disability must affect educational performance in order to qualify for special education services. Of course, in international schools, this issue of qualification is not an issue, but that is the significance of that piece of the definition within IDEA. So what is significantly sub-average intellectual performance? In general, an IQ score of at least 2 standard deviations below the mean is considered an IQ that would be eligible, that would be a qualifying IQ for a student to be eligible for special education services. Typically, IQ tests, most IQ tests have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15 points. And so in order to be 2 standard deviations below the mean, the student would have an IQ score of 100 minus 15 twice. So 2 standard deviations below the mean is an IQ score of 70 on most IQ tests. This issue of qualifying, though, and meeting federal definitions, although it seems clear-cut, when we start looking at things like this bell curve and how intelligence is normally distributed within the population, we realize that this cutoff is a bit arbitrary. Students who don't quite qualify for special education, those who have an IQ score of 75 or even 80, may struggle with parts of the curriculum. They may struggle with learning and need to learn in different ways and have supports to be able to learn the general curriculum. So while this does meet the federal definition, any disability really is that we can think of is not quite as dichotomous as we might have believed. It's not that you either have intellectual disability or you don't. It's that your intellectual performance is somewhere along this continuum, and there's not anything that happens between 70 and 71 that makes those 2 students significantly different from one another. Intellectual disability also affects people's adaptive functioning. And what do we mean by adaptive functioning? Adaptive skills are those skills that are necessary for functioning in everyday life and everyday routines. So these include communicating with others, includes self-care, so brushing your teeth, toileting, dressing, grooming, home living skills, the social skills necessary to interact with and respond to others, being able to use resources in the community, having an understanding of self-direction, knowing basic health and safety rules and how to adhere to those. Functional academics, so not only the cognitive skills that are necessary to solve problems on academic tasks, but how are those used functionally within a person's everyday environment? So how do I use math skills in order to make a purchase, in order to use a vending machine or buy something at a store or at a restaurant? Adaptive skills include those skills necessary to have hobbies and leisure activities, hanging out with friends, and adaptive skills are those that are necessary to translate the skills that you have into work. One of the reasons that I entered the field of special education was this guy here. This is my friend Todd, and Todd and I went to church together all through, probably from preschool until graduation. And Todd has intellectual disabilities. I ran into him. This is a photograph from maybe 6 or 8 years ago when I ran into him at the gym in my hometown when I was visiting over the holidays. And Todd has what would be considered moderate intellectual disability. And but as I think back, we always included Todd, and we always did a great job of including Todd without an IEP or without any specialist telling us exactly how to do so. Todd was an important part of our social group, and so many times when I think about how could we possibly do that, how could we possibly include a student who has intellectual disabilities into a biology class, or how could we include a student with multiple severe disabilities in a second grade classroom. I think back to those experiences with Todd and how he participated in every event of our youth group in high school, and did so successfully and contributed much and learned a lot as well. This is Micah Fialka, and I believe you've already done some reading about Micah. Micah is the son of my friend Janice Fialka, and Micah has intellectual disabilities, grew up in Michigan, and in Michigan, interestingly, remember how we talked about IDEA requires that special education services be provided until a person is 21? Well, in Michigan, services are provided until a person is 26 years old. So just interesting fact about Michigan. Well, Micah, as he finished high school, he wanted to have a college experience. And so his parents approached Oakland University and said, we'd like to have a program for students with intellectual disabilities to continue into higher education. And a lot of people had sort of puzzling thoughts, like, well, why would you do that? The person can't seek a degree. And it's true that Micah would not be eligible for a degree-seeking program. But some of the best things you learn in college have nothing to do with your college degree, and Micah wanted to have that experience. In fact, if we think back to those adaptive skills that we just talked about, many of those are learned in a college experience. How to negotiate new relationships, how to live with people and negotiate household chores and getting along in a new environment. So Micah wanted that part of the experience too. He wanted to move into the dorm. He wanted to have that piece of living with others and that part of the college experience. Well, Oakland University said no, he couldn't do that because he was a degree-seeking student. Well, Micah's parents have always been activists, and he gained a little bit of that skill and said, I want to sue them then. I want to sue them so that I can live in the dorm. And he won. So this is from the Oakland Post, the day that Micah moved into the dorm. Micah began working with his mom. His mom, Janice, presents on family, parent, professional relationships, and wrote a great article years ago, The Dance of the Partnership, Why My Feet Hurt. And Micah began presenting with Janice, and he began presenting on what it's like to be a person with intellectual disabilities and be subjected to our services. And Syracuse University caught on to this and said, this is fantastic. We'd love for our special education faculty to benefit from what Micah has to say. And they hired him and started a program. And so they hired him at Syracuse University. In getting ready to go to Syracuse University, Micah orchestrated his move, and they had to dig up the old paperwork that showed that Micah qualified, that he had an intellectual disability, so that he could qualify for services for people with disabilities there in New York. Janice wrote me as this happened and said she was shocked. She had forgotten what Micah's tested IQ was, because he is so amazing, and it's easy to forget what that score was that would have qualified him for services. So take a minute and see if you could guess, given what you know so far about intellectual disabilities and what you know about Micah from reading about him, what do you think his IQ score might have been? Well, Janice and I and lots of people were surprised to learn that Micah's IQ score was 40. And you might have gasped as you read that, as I said this. And I was surprised too, because even though I'm always teaching people, don't think about the score. The score is just as Kathy Snow would say, a socio-political passport to services, and move on to the goals that matter. I must admit, I think that most of us would see that score and have an idea of what that person's future, how that person's future might look. And we might have not shot for as high of a goal as Micah has achieved. And so it is important that these scores do provide important information. They give us a starting point. They give us an understanding of a diagnosis perhaps, or where to begin and what supports might be necessary. But they shouldn't be how we determine goals. And with that 40 there, I'm having trouble seeing Micah. I can't see him so well there with that 40. So we get that 40, and then we let that go away so that we can then focus on a student's interests and a student's skills. Micah enjoys public speaking. He enjoys being with people and interacting with people, and has a lot to share and a lot that he can teach us. In fact, you may have read online already that Micah was appointed by President Obama to his committee for persons with disabilities. The lesson here is that your brain and your understanding of families and understanding of students and their interests is far more important than any protocol. It's more important than any testing outcome that comes across your desk. And this is certainly not to minimize the importance of school psychologists and the work that they do. The point is that it's not the end point. It's not how we determine goals for students who have intellectual disabilities. It's simply how we get information on their present level of development and in the U.S., how they qualify for services. When we think about classifying intellectual disabilities, we can think of 3 to 4 categories. Mild intellectual disability is generally associated with an IQ score of around 50 to 55, up to 70. Moderate intellectual disability, 35 to 40 to 50 to 55. And severe and profound, below 35 or 40. Most students, most people who have intellectual disabilities have mild, fall into the mild range. At least 85% of people who have intellectual disabilities have mild intellectual disability. Severe and profound intellectual disability makes up less than 5% of people who have intellectual disabilities, and because of the way standard deviations work, 2% of the population has an intellectual disability, and so this would be 5% of 2%. So a very small proportion of the population has severe, profound intellectual disability. So where are students with intellectual disabilities found in schools? Right now, about 17% of students with intellectual disabilities are found in the general education classroom all day. About 27% of students with intellectual disabilities are served in the general education classroom, but are also served part of the day in resource rooms or as in international schools, as they're known as learning support classrooms. About 48% of students with intellectual disabilities are served all day in a self-contained or separate classroom. And some students with intellectual disabilities are served in a separate school placement. Now remember, with Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, The requirement is that students are served in the least restrictive environment. And so you can see the top of this list is the least restrictive possibility, and other, if other means a separate location from a school where a student is districted in a, if we're talking about public school, the other would be the most restrictive environment. And so, again, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act does not say that all students must be educated in the general education classroom all the time. It says that the student must be served in the least restrictive environment that can effectively meet the student's needs. That means, can the student achieve his or her IEP goals within that setting, or is additional support that is in a more restrictive setting needed? So what are the characteristics of intellectual disability? There are delays in cognitive functioning. Students who have intellectual disabilities have difficulty remembering information. They often have poor working memory and a slower rate of learning. Some estimates include that students with disabilities may need to be taught a concept 10 times the number of times as a student without disabilities. There can be poor attention to tasks, and they may not notice and be able to pay attention to the relevant parts of a task. It can be difficult for a student who has intellectual disabilities to identify what are the most important pieces, and so may need support in order to do that. So a student may understand that they need to complete a math problem, but may struggle to recognize what the addition sign is, and that signals that you do add without additional prompts from the teacher. Students with intellectual disabilities have difficulty with generalization and maintenance. Remember, we talked about the development of skills, that first you acquire a skill, you demonstrate you can do it, then you become fluent with the skill, then you're able to maintain it beyond the instructional period, and then you're able to generalize it to other settings. And so students who have intellectual disabilities struggle with the higher parts of skill acquisition. And so many times I hear people say, well, the student had it, but then they forgot it. That's common for students who have intellectual disabilities. And so we have to systematically attend to supporting the student to maintain and generalize a skill. So generalizing is being able to use the skill across settings, and maintaining is ability to keep using the skill over time without instruction. So a student may correctly identify 1/2 and 1/4 of a circle in math when the skill is first taught. However, when the student tries to cook, the student may struggle to identify and measure 1/2 and 1/4 of a cup. Later, when learning the same fractions with a square instead of a circle, that's generalizing the skill to the measuring cup and to the square. The teacher may need to review the information and show the connections explicitly. Sometimes students with intellectual disabilities may not appear to be motivated to learn, or have a lack of interest with more difficult problem-solving tasks. And so when we think about scaffolding, we have to think about the very small steps. So instead of having the next step be as difficult or as big of a step as we might present, typically we may have to give very small, frequent steps to help build the student's skills and help the student to stay motivated, to stay in the student's zone of proximal development. Students who have intellectual disabilities typically have trouble with money skills, with self-care and daily living, and so support and instruction are needed on a continual basis to learn and continue to maintain self-care skills. One of the things that parents of students with intellectual disabilities that I know struggle with the most is that their child has difficulty making and maintaining friendships. And this would be a good place for the group to have some conversation about friendships. How can you as teachers help students who have intellectual disabilities not only develop academic skills, but learn the skill of making friends and maintaining friendships? How do you help typically developing students include students who have intellectual disabilities? There are many success stories of students with significant intellectual disabilities having and maintaining friends, and there's a lot of heartbreak out there too. And so how as teachers, educators, administrators, counselors, how can we help with social development of students who have intellectual disabilities? What is our role with the student who has intellectual disabilities? And what is our role with the general student population, with students who are typically developing? How do we promote this? We may see students be socially immature, sometimes have behavioral challenges. So sometimes students who have intellectual disabilities may exhibit some of the tantruming that you expect in a 3-year-old much later. They may exhibit that behavior, that type of behavior, as a 10, 12-year-old. And how does that look in a classroom? And how do you manage that? And how do you help that not interrupt the development and maintaining of friendships? Students with intellectual disabilities may also resist change. We'll talk about this adherence to routines also for students who have autism. Intellectual disability is a lifelong disability. For those of you who are working with young children, it may be that in kindergarten or first grade or even second grade that the intellectual disability is identified. The milder the disability, the more likely it is to be identified later, because it may not be evident in preschool, may not be evident even in kindergarten. You may be wondering, is this a developmental delay or is this intellectual disability? For those of you who are working with younger children and this diagnosis may be given in early childhood, knowing that it is a lifelong disability, it is a difficult diagnosis for families to hear. It's a difficult diagnosis for families to accept, and we'll talk more about that within the families class. But that's an important, for those of you working with young children, it's important to be sensitive to diagnoses that are lifelong. Students with intellectual disabilities generally have a positive disposition. They typically work hard. Clearly the discrepancies between a student in kindergarten who has intellectual disabilities and typically developing peers and that same student in upper grades is different. In upper grades there's a greater discrepancy because the developmental curves begin to move apart from one another, and we see greater differences. What are the implications there? It's easier to include a student who has intellectual disabilities in early childhood than it is in upper grades. That would be a good point of conversation as well. How do you envision your school being able to include students with intellectual disabilities in early grades, in upper grades? What would be the least restrictive environment, hypothetically, as you think about different scenarios? And how could those transitions be made smoothly? Students with intellectual disabilities may have trouble imitating behaviors. So often we learn appropriate social behaviors through imitation. We have to be more explicit in teaching many behaviors for students who have intellectual disabilities. Social stories can be a great way to teach explicitly the behaviors and skills that social skills and behaviors that students with intellectual disabilities need. Students with intellectual disabilities may have lower stamina in attending to information for long periods of time, and so we have to think about how do we provide support to attend, but also how do we provide breaks at appropriate amounts of time. So when you think about just the developmental sequence and young children. So if we think about the preschool children at your school and how long they can attend. So preschool teachers, kindergarten teachers, think about how long can students attend to a given lesson or task that you've given. And then let's think about our upper grades. How long can students attend to a task? And so the developmental sequence is that this builds over time. And so a student with intellectual disabilities may lag behind and be much more like a younger child in terms of attention span and ability to engage for a long period of time. For students with mild intellectual disabilities, fewer significant educational interventions are needed. Students with mild intellectual disabilities have a cognitive ability somewhere equivalent to the 8 to 11-year-old range, 3rd to 5th grade level. And these students are typically not identified until early elementary school. Students with moderate intellectual disabilities do require more significant intensive interventions. Their cognitive ability is somewhere in the 4 to 7-year-old range or preschool to 2nd grade level. Students are able to follow a schedule, understand time, especially with visual prompts. And so visual prompts and explicit teaching of social conventions and social behaviors and routines, and allowing limited choices, providing many choices so the student can make choices, are examples of interventions that we would want to embed throughout the day. Students with moderate intellectual disabilities usually require ongoing support throughout their lives. They often live in a group home or live with family or live sometimes in supported environments like apartments with the support of an adult, with formal support, oftentimes of a service to help the person be successful. People who have severe and profound intellectual disabilities require intensive intervention, often medical intervention as well, because severe and profound intellectual disabilities are often accompanied by other diagnoses. These people require consistent lifelong support and intervention. Some skills are able to be mastered, but need to be reviewed. So for example, a person with severe, profound disabilities may be able to learn to feed himself, feed herself, but there may be a need for continued support or partial support all of the time in order to be successful at that. Students who have severe and profound intellectual disabilities may have little to no speech. Although it's important to remember that because a person has little to no speech doesn't necessarily mean the person has an intellectual disability. However, those people who do have severe or profound intellectual disability have little or no speech. People with severe or profound intellectual disability are sometimes able to use gestures like pointing or gestures to make a selection. There are many different causes of intellectual disabilities. A little over a third are due to genetic factors that can be identified. About a third are due to some sort of trauma or toxin. And about a third of intellectual disabilities are of unknown origin. Most people with intellectual disabilities do not have any brain structural or biological origin to their disability. So there are biological causes of intellectual disability. 2/3 of those who have severe or profound intellectual disability have a biological cause as the origin. There are prenatal causes. There are a number of chromosomal disorders. There are metabolic disorders, fetal alcohol syndrome. So maternal use of alcohol is one of the more common causes of intellectual disability. There is a correlation between increased paternal age, increased father's age, and increased chance of intellectual disability and autism, and we're not sure why. There are maternal illnesses, medications for those illnesses that can also impact brain development. There are injuries and there are biological causes that are perinatal, during or shortly after birth. Prematurity can cause intellectual disability because of underdeveloped lungs providing inadequate oxygen to the brain. There can be injuries at birth with the umbilical cord. There can be a difficult birth can cause oxygen deprivation. And there are neonatal disorders that are within the first 28 days of life, such as seizures and strokes that can cause intellectual disability. There are biological causes after birth, such as traumatic brain injury, inadequate nutrition, seizure disorders that last, and a number of diseases that can impact the brain. There are also a number of environmental causes of intellectual disability. These can include too few opportunities to develop language at home. It can be poor interaction opportunities at home. Poverty, and malnutrition can cause intellectual disability. We talked about how alcohol use, maternal use of alcohol, can biologically cause intellectual disability, but also parent drug use, excessive alcohol use, smoking can also contribute to intellectual disability. Limited opportunities to develop language include not having enough models of language and interaction. A point that might be interesting to discuss here: many times in international settings, families, expatriate families, have nannies to care for their young children until they're old enough to go to school. And sometimes we do see developmental delays occur, not necessarily intellectual disability, but we see that sometimes developmental delays occur because the nanny and the children speak different languages and are not using each of the languages in order to interact. And so sometimes there can be less interaction than is needed for optimal development. Child abuse and neglect can be causes of intellectual disability. A parent, one of the parents having an intellectual disability is associated with intellectual disability. So how do we support students who have intellectual disabilities? One of the strategies that we use is task analysis. We'll learn more about this in the intervention planning course. But in task analysis, we break up a procedure into many steps, and we teach each of these steps explicitly and support the student with less and less support, with less and less help in order to gain the full skill. We use visual schedules, so we use pictures or concrete objects to help students remember. They can be used to remember parts of tasks. They can be used to represent concepts that are more abstract. We find creative ways to work on individualized goals within hands-on activities. So an example that I like to give is, let's say we're working on mineral identification. We're teaching fifth graders how to use Mohs hardness scale and other characteristics to identify what mineral, identify and sort minerals. For a student who has intellectual disability, this goal may be out of reach. However, this is a hands-on activity. We can find something worthwhile to teach that student within that activity. And so we may have a fifth grade student who has intellectual disabilities, who is at the time cognitively more like a 5-year-old. And so working on sorting and classifying, we can still do. So all students are working on sorting and classifying, It's that the students who are on grade level are working on sorting and classifying using Mohs hardness scale and a set of criteria outlined. And it may be that the student with intellectual disabilities is learning to sort and classify by shape, by size, by texture. And so we can find creative ways to map the skill that students who are on grade level are working on to the appropriate level for the student who has intellectual disabilities. Anytime we can use manipulatives, concrete materials, that's a good thing. Consistent routines are helpful because then the student is not thinking about how's the routine changing today and what am I supposed to do. And so as much that we can keep the same as possible is good. And of course, we want to do this for all students, right? But it's particularly helpful for students who have intellectual disabilities. Build on their strengths and what they like. What do they enjoy? And so Micah certainly demonstrates how when we seek out interest-based learning opportunities and we support students in what they want to do and what they enjoy, that really the sky is the limit for what they can achieve. So what I'd like you to think about is in an international setting, because of the nature of intellectual disabilities, sometimes students aren't admitted. In fact, most of the time, students with intellectual disabilities are not admitted into international schools. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about families being split? Sometimes there's a family that has a child in your school, and a child with a disability is born later, and maybe the student has physical disabilities, maybe the student has intellectual disabilities, and that child has to go to a different school. Maybe that child doesn't have any opportunities in the family's country of residence. Maybe that child has to go somewhere else. Maybe that child has to go live with family in the US, for example, to be able to receive services. How do we feel about that? How do we feel about families being split across schools or even across countries? Is it our responsibility to serve students who have intellectual disability if their families are a part of our school? Is it a part of our responsibility if a family is not a part of our school? If we feel it's a part of our responsibility, what would we have to put in place? What would be necessary for us and the child and family to be successful? I look forward to hearing about your conversations and hearing your discussion on what you like about the idea of including students who have intellectual disabilities, the challenges that you might anticipate, and what you might do to solve some of the challenges and reach across some of the barriers.